Why did you, a few days ago, decide to go public with your story?
He said the allegations were patently false against him. I knew otherwise. I knew what kind of guy he was.
He said he would help me. He wanted to help me.
And I thought, wow, he's going to be a mentor for me.
And I said, I will go up and meet with you in your office, but you are not allowed to touch me. And he said, He kind of laughed it off, and he shook my hand, though, and he said, I won't.
He invited me to a business meeting that we were supposed to talk about career stuff, and we were supposed to meet in the lobby. And when I got there, he wasn't there. He called me and asked me to come to his room.
I remember the lurch when I went to the desk and I said, Mr. Weinstein, is he on the patio? And they said, he's in his room. And I was like, kidding me.
But when we entered the bedroom, the whole time he's talking, and it never stopped, you have to understand this, what he had going on, what projects were coming, what he thought I would be right for. He dropped his robe, went into the bathroom in front of me, and began to use the toilet.
And then he excused himself to go to the bathroom. And when he came back, he was just in a robe and, as I mentioned, buck naked.
He opened the door to the room in an open robe.
Then he got increasingly lascivious and rude and got out of the hot tub, and I went to reach for my purse and I told him, this is ridiculous, and I'm leaving, and he grabbed my arm.
On the table he had a bunch of papers, and he said, listen, these are contracts for my next 3 films. I will sign them right now, but I want you to have a threesome with me and my assistant.
I said I wanted to go. He left the room again, and this time he came back fully naked, and he was blocking the door.
I'm 5'1", he's 6'2", he's much, much larger than me. He was blocking the only exit out.
As he followed me, he told me he would give me a 3-picture deal and he could get my movie made, but you gotta stay and watch me masturbate. And he just kept grabbing his penis and fondling himself, and finally I ran for the door.
He told me that I would make a bad decision if I got out of there, that it would be bad for me, it would be bad for my career.
He backed me into a dark room and he held me down and he forced oral sex on me, basically.
I was sitting on the bed talking to her.
Petra Carlsson, for I don't know which time, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back.
Maybe 2 months ago or so, we went to Lund together with a number of other people. Anthony Paul Smith was there, LeRon Schultz was there, Joel Kulin, my former podcast partner, was the organizer. And we had a lovely 2 days together and talked about Deleuze and theology. You presented a paper, and I was thinking that we're going to talk about that paper a little bit today. You write about Deleuze and Guattari and their notion of desiring machines. And they write that we live today in an age of partial objects, bricks that have been shattered to bits and leftovers. We no longer believe in the myth of the existence of fragments that, like pieces of an antique statue, are merely waiting for the last one to be turned up so that they may all be glued back together to create a unity that is precisely the same as the original unity. Can you say something about that quote and how we no longer believe in an original unity and what that does to our process of thinking, of creating?
I took that quote as a starting point in that paper because I find that it holds, I guess, both answers to the problems that we're facing now in the world politically and theologically, but also the solutions. I've been living with their machine idea for quite a few years now in different ways since I first read it. And when I was going to Lund, he wanted us all to talk about the cross. And I hadn't related the machine idea to the cross before. But once I just started thinking about it, I just came across this idea of the first the origin of the word itself, of the word machine itself, which is the mechane, which is an old Greek construction that was used at the theaters to lift up the character or statue as the god in the play, the Deus Ex Machina, the god figure that comes from nowhere and is lifted onto the stage and then placed there to change everything and to be removed again.
When you talk now, I relate it to Charles Winquist, who talks about beginning in the middle of experience and how that means, in a certain, I think, Heideggerian sense, that we're thrown into the world, and that even the beginning of our notion of the beginning is filled with different myths and ideologies, and I think he even says dogs and crystals.
Yeah, exactly, which is also, I think, there in Deleuze and Guattari's crystal, the time crystal idea. The fact that every moment is just this crystal prisma of different flashes from the future and the past, and all just creating this crystal of the now. And it's the same with the cross. Whenever it appears and whenever that idea appears, it's just this assemblage of experiences and thoughts and dogma, and also this artifacts, the wooden crosses and things. Whenever they are present, they do something happens. But at the same time, it is just this assemblage, and we may deconstruct it and reconstruct it. And I mean, that happens whether we do so or not, but the possibility is also there for us to take part in it.
A paragraph in your text that I really appreciated was, a machine is not a given, it is a construction, an organization of separate elements. A machine is made up of partial objects forming a whole out of heterogeneous bits, not because they belong together, not because they were meant for each other, but because creation is possible, construction is possible.
I talked in that paper also about the constructivist art movement in Russia just before the revolution. And they had these ideas of us being able to make constructions out of the world that we have, and so create new futures. Of course, they didn't want the kind of future that emerged in Russia after the revolution. And Lyubov Popova, whom I've been studying the most, she even died in 1924. But through her, I've come to realize that machine idea that is there in Deleuze and Guattari, it can also be made really concrete. I mean, she just starts making new things out of the elements, like the canvas, the color, the paint. But later also she starts working at a textile fabric factory, wanting to actually, with her hands and with machines, create and construct a world where there is room for differences and where there is room for equality. And it's just a beautiful vision, which is also, I think, possible.
We're talking about, implicitly at least, a critique against representational logics. When we assume there is no such thing as this neutral or empty starting ground from which everything is then created at once, being is given once and for all, as Henri Bergson writes, that's how we're taught because we're Platonist culturally still. That being is given. But here there is no original blueprint. There is no original to represent this is what's it. And from it, we can pick things apart and we can construct things anew. It's interesting to talk about politics this way, because I see it all the time how the representational logic comes back again and again, even in secular political discourses. If you were to sort of give an advice to people who are working in politics today, how to think about these things and perhaps help them to see what kind of mistakes or risks there are with using a representational logic.
This takes us a bit away from politics, but I think back again. And I'm thinking of a lecture I heard recently of Samuel Rubensson, who's a patristics professor in Lund, actually, and also at the Orthodox Seminary in Södertälje. They have been doing this long-time project studying the early church. As all Christians know, there is often a romanticized talk about the early church, and this is how the Christians did in the beginning, and it's like this purity and the idea of all the goodness being gathered in that first start, and that is one of those origins and a pure origin, in a sense, that such an idea that we carry. But their project with many scholars over many years, it shows, he says, that the history of Christianity is not a tree with like this one origin, but it's a river with just all these different sources and springs and that somehow gather together to some extent and then separate again, and so it's just not there. And if we accept that is okay, so then there never was a one beginning. There were many beginnings, and they didn't have a clue what they were doing. They didn't know more than we do. I mean, they just sat there trying to gather their thoughts in a similar manner that we do now, and it's never been better. It's never been clear. It's never been one message. Bringing that kind of acceptance and insight into politics, I think, would change the very idea of having an agenda. It would change the way that we relate to each other, because I think that there is some kind of imperative in that way of thinking, because if you assume that that's what the world is like, then there is no option but to be humble. I mean, deeply respectful towards difference. And in that sense, I think it would radically change politics. It would not be about me wanting everyone to understand that I know the way forward and I know where we came from and I know the solution. But we could actually work together, knowing that, well, we don't know where we came from and we don't know where we're going, but let's be respectful towards the complexity of the situation that we're in and start trying to create the world that we want, whatever that is.
Lately, I've been thinking about this in relation to the Me Too uprising. All these diverse, oftentimes or mostly female voices telling their stories, their experiences about sexual harassments and abuse and rape. And I think, in a sense, this is a picking apart of the way we've organized our societies. I think it's fantastic that this is happening. At the same time, I'm a little bit worried, because when I open a newspaper or watch television and they talk about this, I sense that there is a territorialization of this event, and that we all have ready-made solutions for how to interpret what is going on. Regardless of what is happening, what is said, people end up with the same conclusion they had prior to the event. I think that has an effect on these liberating forces that has finally been liberated, that they might not shake things up that much as I guess most people would like them to.
Yes, yeah, that's probably right. I think, since we're experiencing the huge effects of this in Sweden, I think as it's not the same kind of movement in every country, but here it's in every newspaper every day. And I think that we were. It was timing. Sweden was ready for it, I think. So I think that could be an explanation. Yes, I completely agree. I'm just thrilled, and I'm so happy that this is happening, and it feels like this raw uprising of women, and of course, I myself, I could tell so many stories from friends and my own experiences, and I mean, it's really, I think it's liberating on a collective and individual level for so many. But at the same time, I think that you're right. It's because I find that to one extent this is a deconstruction of some kind of power structure, however you may analyze or name that. It's made me think also of one anecdotal piece of history that I've been studying quite a lot, and that's the prison movement, which Deleuze and Foucault and Sartre and others were active, where they wanted precisely this, but with those imprisoned, they wanted to give them the voices and to stand up, and they just wanted to gather precisely these kind of list of abuses and experiences, and just to let it out there, what's really happening, like beneath all our systematic kind of analyses. But of course it failed, because our way of thinking doesn't let it happen. As soon as these differences appear, someone will want to try to see a pattern. And the one with the clearest idea of what kind of pattern this is will systemize it and territorialize it, and then it becomes his or her agenda definition and part of what we already know. So, and just a confirmation of a theory that was already there, or something like that.
In your text that we referred to in the beginning, you talk about the Deus ex machina. I have a way to bring this together, perhaps. So maybe you can explain what is the Deus ex machina? How did it function in Greece?
Yeah, it was this machine that was a wooden construction, and it was used at the theaters. I mean, the Deus ex machina is also a concept within like filmmaking and literary theory and so on today, and it signifies then the unexpected savior that comes from nowhere and enters into a scene where there seems to be no hope in the plot, in the story that you're watching, but then some kind of a rescuer appears, and you realize, oh, this could be a turning point, and it is, and then they always have to keep struggling a bit, but then the solution comes in the end. So that's the Deus ex machina as a concept. But in the Greek theater, it was an actual machine, a construction, a wooden arm that would lift up a god or someone acting like a god and place the god in the actor's midst on the stage. And then the plot would change due to that presence, and then the machine, the wooden arm, would lift the god back up again and away from the stage. And yes, do let me know how this relates to the Me Too.
Okay, so here's my thing. I actually thought about this when we were in Lund, not in relation to Me Too perhaps, but at least in relation to the guy I want to bring up, who's Spinoza. Because Spinoza critiques the Cartesian notion of the ego, the Cartesian I. And I think that he's doing so by also talking about a Deus ex machina, which he refers to as the theological illusion. In order to make the Cartesian ego work the way Descartes wanted it to, he needed a Deus machina. He needed to invoke a god that fixed his worldview. Let's put it like this. Effects on the body was perceived as final causes of the ego's own actions. But the ego cannot be responsible for the making of the universe, for example. We cannot see ourselves as the originator of everything. And so in order to keep the worldview in place and give an account for the creation of the universe, there needed to be a god that completed the image that Descartes was making. And this is presupposed in our culture. We assume that we in the Western world are freed from organized religion. We're secular. We don't believe in God. But I do think that this underlying logic, which is presupposed, not articulated, still governs us. And so the representational logic that Spinoza critiqued is still present beneath what we're doing. And I do think that this logic is ruling us in ways that we don't understand. And so when we try to include the other, it translates to territorializing judgment, because what Spinoza saw in Descartes was that morality, it translates to obedience. You can't enter into the realm of the law. As Kafka writes, there's always another step. So it's a kind of negative theology. You never enter into the law. The only way to know the law is to listen and obey the people who are preaching negative judgment about the law. And those negative judgment tells us what things are not. They don't tell us what is. And so when we say that we believe in equality, we can't say what equality means. We can only say what equality is not. And in this sense, the logic keeps molding our society and reducing differences. And I think that is what might happen within the Me Too movement.
I've just been correcting exams. I shouldn't say this actually here on the podcast, I don't think, because I haven't given them back to the students yet. But it was on Descartes, among other things. And yes, it's so. I mean, just the thing that the phenomena that with Descartes. I mean, what we know. If anyone knows anything about the Descartes, it's the cogito ergo sum. I mean, people in general, and then it's the idea of it's the creator of the subject. He came up with the idea of the subject, but this, just as you say, this immaterial entity that he found, the only thing he couldn't doubt in the end, for him was inevitably attached to this deus ex machina, the other materiality, the transcendent materiality. But the fact that we have, and since I teach theology students, I think that they should know this. They should know also the connection to the transcendent immaterial God in Descartes' thinking, which many philosophy students might not hear as much about. But I also find it telling that we do not know that, because we have this idea that Descartes and modernity after him created the modern subject, and we have this free individual, the I, who can think freely and doubt everything and question everything and so on. But that's just an illusion, because it is attached to the transcendent God, just as it is in Descartes. But we keep just neglecting or omitting or hiding that fact, I think. And I think that you're exactly right in relating that to the Me Too, that we've had this the church, the Me Too in the church. So there have been phone calls among all the women ministers in the Church of Sweden, of course, and I've been reflecting over that well, what stories fit, and that's also been a question. Like, well, if you hear someone whistle after you on the street, is that a sexual harassment? What fits? Because it has to fit into our idea of equality and inequality. So it really isn't an open scene for any experience, and like for the differences of experiences. And of course, I mean, you have to label things in one way or another. It's just like practical, the way the world unfortunately works. I mean, but it's easy to get this to be fooled by the fact that this is reality speaking on its own terms, but it isn't, because it still has. We're still connected to that, the Deus ex machina in Descartes. I mean, the God that comes in and renders the subject idea legitimate and trustworthy and so on.
For people who read Nietzsche, you can see how he connects the death of God to the death of the individual. You can't have the one without the other. And the same goes for established values, because this whole worldview created around this, as we now label it, the Deus Ex Machina, that connects to the way we've organized our justice system with personal responsibility for one's actions. As Spinoza points out, that it has to do with obedience, but it's also that since we have free will, we're supposed to allow for our minds to control our bodily passions. We create a twisted understanding about ourselves. And I think this is quite natural process. I think it happens to us rather than us doing it on purpose. But we create a world where we're at the center, where our ego is at the center. And Descartes was brilliant in creating a sort of rationalization of the experience of being a subject. But of course, it affects also how we look at ourselves as subjects, how we think of ourselves as subjects, and how we organize the world accordingly. And it fit at the time the industrialization, it fit the emerging democratic system and so on. And I think something worth thinking about when we're in a time where you have all these voices sort of scrambling the code that has folded our society. We're living through also a time where there is a new boom of information that has totally transformed the world, where perhaps the capitalist system that has been sort of the ruling principle for our societies for the past 100 years might not be the highest principle in the future. And so if we create a reaction against capitalism today, we might not actually be part of shaping the society of the future, because we're protesting against a world that is no longer. The folding of the new world keeps going on somewhere else.
Yeah, I guess to some extent that's always the way it happens, though. And while we're busy trying to figure out what we're doing, we are also constructing new worlds.
Yeah.
And it's always been that way, I think. And so it's probably all at once. But your reasoning now takes me back to the idea of the constructivists, the art constructivists that I'm so into right now. One of them, Alexander Rodchenko, he had, I think he was in Paris, and this was in the early 1900s, and it was like he saw the capitalism, the way that the Western Europeans related to things, this the rise of the free will. I mean, the free will as a consumer. You choose what things you want. You furnish your room. You are the master of the room that you yourself create, and then through that kind of mastery, you reign. You rule your world with the things that you own, and so on. And then you believe that you have the freedom to create your world, and also, of course, the future, and that you can you can use things, nature, and so on, in order to create the future that you want. And with that idea, you need the idea of the subject, the free subject, of course, but also the idea, consciously or not, of the transcendent God that will legitimize the whole project and give you the agenda, the kind of truth, your goal, tell us where you're heading at. But he said, our things in our hand must be equals, comrades. I mean, we're in communist circles now. Comrades, and not these black, mournful slaves as they are here. I just find it so beautiful that he sees the things in Paris in the hands of the Parisians as slaves. It's just needing to obey the free will of the Parisians, instead of this kind of humble relationship to what these things can do, and maybe they can reconstruct me. And I mean, putting that in relation to the Me Too voices. I mean, these many stories, all these narratives, different narratives. I mean, not seen as one, not the same, but as plurality, multiplicity. How can they change me and our world? And not how can they? How do they go with the idea of the world I already had? But how can they challenge me deeply? And just the multiplicity of them, because I mean, just the fact that we have all these voices gathered in all these documents, it's wonderful, and because it's deconstructive, and it constructs something that is not a oneness but a multiplicity, and it's beautiful, and we should take it as that.
Going back to what I said about we're living through this shift from capitalism to something other, some people might not think that is true at all and sort of interpret the information age within a capitalist understanding. But I would say that if you look at the Me Too phenomenon, I think that is in itself a proof of this, because it's information online and you can't buy yourself free from it if you're accused. It doesn't matter if Harvey Weinstein has tons of millions of dollars at his bank account, because if the information comes out, it's out and you can't really separate yourself from it. And it comes back then, I think, to there being a power struggle at the same time, which is apparent, especially in the United States at the moment, having to do with net neutrality, because the old authorities will, of course, want to keep their power. And so they want to build virtual walls on the internet so that information can't pass as freely as it's been doing since the origin of the internet. What I'm saying is that if something like Me Too, all these liberating forces that are now set in motion, if that is territorialized by reactionary politics that relates to capitalism, then in turn, I think I want to interpret that as them being conservatives, trying to protect the world that has been, rather than looking to what we can create in the future.
I completely agree with that. I do think that's true. At the same time, I find that the idea of the world being ready to take in that kind of the difference, I mean, the actual challenge of what you just said there, I think it's a few years ahead, and in that, or behind or up or below, I don't know, but somewhere where we aren't right now. And for that reason, I also think that, well, we have these tools that we have. I mean, this is a more pragmatic way of thinking that, well, obviously we still have that kind of transcendence. The representational logic is still ruling us, and to some extent it seems that politically and pragmatically we have to move within it. Although I agree with you that we probably won't see the kind of differences and changes that we want, radical kind of changes. As long as we just keep analyzing things in order to be able to put them in the old boxes, the same old boxes.
I have one final thought about this Me Too phenomenon that has to do with the Cartesian notion of free will and the Cartesian ego, and that has to do also with desires, that we're suppressing our desires. This is something that came to mind because in Sweden, most of the people, at least being accused for sexual harassment or rape or something in public, has been men with a public feminist persona.
Yeah.
There's been quite a few of them. And I think the easiest explanation to why that is that they're hypocrites. They've been playing a game because that's how they can lure women to themselves, or how they can make themselves feel safe for women so that they can sleep with them. And then they've sort of stepped over some line or something in that. But I don't think they've been hypocritical. For example, Lars Ohly, who's been the party leader of the Left Party, very outspoken feminist. I think he was genuine, and that he is genuine in his egalitarian beliefs. It's just that the assumption that your pure ideology, your complete and pure ideology, will save you from your desires is is wrong, because your desires, if they're just left unchecked, if you deny that you even have them, you will fall short at times. And I think that's what happened, rather than them being hypocritical.
Yes, I think that the entire idea of being hypocritical and as opposed to being genuine, and I mean all those kind of notions of what a person is simplifying, in the sense that, well, we're always more than that at once. So it's not that easy. I mean, it's not like someone is actually wanting just to trick someone into something by saying that they're a feminist. I don't think it's that easy. And yet I think that, well, if I go to myself, for instance, I can see that there is, I mean, we're just all part of this. We're part of this world, all of us, and we have these habitual ways of thinking and doing, and I don't think it necessarily has to do with desires. I mean, it's not that you just have to suppress all of your desires in order not to be a dirty old man. Or at least I hope not. I mean, there must have been a kind of prior suppression that has put you in that situation. But then I also realize in myself that I have known a few of these. I mean, I know that these dirty old men, so to say, have been around, but I have never thought of the idea that I could raise my voice to say that that's not okay. I mean, not that I've been personally abused in that sense, but, you know, just the acceptance of that as a kind of phenomena that makes it possible for us and for them and for everyone to just keep doing those kind of things that have been happening, and it's a part of, I think it's just a part of us all. It's not like there are good guys and bad guys, but we're just all in this together.
I think that's a good way to finish this conversation. Thank you so much, Petra, for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you.
Henri Bergson writes that humankind suffers from the habit of asking poor metaphysical questions. His claim is that by proceeding from emptiness to fullness, from non-being to being, we raise non-existent problems that imprisons our minds and consequently prevents us from recognizing the continuous creation of unforeseeable novelty. What is at issue here is the natural proclivity of the human mind to work upon a phantom of duration rather than duration itself. The overwhelming tendency to confuse the less with the more has thus, according to Bergson, resulted in a quest for a superintelligence outside of time, when in truth our understanding is already disconnected from the mobility of the real. The task Bergson set out for himself was therefore to aim for higher precision in philosophy by getting back into duration. Since being is not seen by Bergson as given once and for all, he does not consider movement as the space covered between privileged actualization of ideas or between immanent material elements, but as a qualitative transformation of the whole. Real movement is thus perceived as concrete duration, and as Deleuze points out in Cinema 1, the duration or the whole is a spiritual reality which constantly changes according to its own relations. One of Bergson's favorite images to explain this is Zeno's paradox involving Achilles and the tortoise, in which the apparent paradox depends on movement being understood as the space covered between Achilles and the tortoise. Since the whole is presupposed as given, movement is seen as divisible, but as should be clear by now, according to Bergson, all real change is indivisible change, a qualitative transformation of the whole. This move by Bergson implies a firm rejection of representational thinking, which means that difference will no longer be subordinated to any logic of the one.